Chapter 33, Don't Trust History. Here's a concept that I've been intrigued with for quite a while. The first time it made an impact on me was when I read about it in a book by William Burroughs, the beat writer. Burroughs said, "History does not exist." At first I was confused, but then he went on to say that everything in life has the potential to be manipulated by those in power to suit their purposes. Burroughs said the written word is easily altered over time, as are sound recordings via splicing and resplicing. Photographs can be airbrushed and historical texts are compiled by whoever wins the war. The victor can also go back and destroy a people's existing history and replace it with something that more suits their needs. Read Orwell's 1984. But what about videotape? That's a distinct record of history, isn't it? Not necessarily. At the moment of recording, it is, but look at the government invasion at Waco and how, through the use of editing, a completely different picture emerged from what really took place. Thus, in a larger sense, anything over time can be altered and remade. A perfect example is the Tom Hanks movie Forrest Gump. You remember the scene where he's shaking hands with JFK? It's so real you could easily believe it took place if presented in a different context. So, Burroughs is basically saying that all of us should be very wary of what is considered history, for it can and is being manipulated for very specific purposes, and always has been. Chapter 34. Why did Americans finance the Bolshevik Revolution? Let's jump right into the fire on this one. The Bolshevik Revolution was an uprising started by poor Russians, proletariats, against their czarist overlords. Instead, international communism was created and financed by American capitalists and European aristocrats, not to help the downtrodden, but to increase their own power and further enslave those who were lower on the socioeconomic ladder. If the above scenario doesn't fit into the historical picture that has been painted for us, the first question we should ask is, why doesn't someone in the media point out this discrepancy? In all honesty, with a little bit of research, any journalist in the country could blow the roof off these atrocious misrepresentations. But they don't. Why? John Swinton, former editor of the New York Times, said it best in 1914 at the annual dinner of the American Press Association. Quote, "There is no such thing as an independent press in America. Not a man among you dares utter his honest opinion. Were you to utter it, you know beforehand that it would never appear in print. It is the duty of a New York journalist to lie, to revile, to toady at the feet of Mammon, to sell his country and his race for his daily bread, or what amounts to the same thing, his salary." Quote, "We are the tools and vassals of the rich behind the scenes. We are marionettes. These men pull the strings and we dance. Our time, our talents, our lives, and our capacities are all the property of these men. We are intellectual property." End quote. As far as I can tell, the situation hasn't changed one iota in the last 90 years. So prior to delving into the mechanics of the Bolshevik Revolution, I'd like to string a bunch of quotes before you. A point about Colonel House. Many people were suspicious of Woodrow Wilson, our country's most weak-spined commander-in-chief ever, and his administration's reactions during the Bolshevik Revolution. The questions became so probing that a man named Colonel House, one of the shrewdest invisibles of all time, told him on November 28, 1917, "It is exceedingly important that such criticism should be suppressed." Russian General Arseny D. Gulevich, Tsarism and the revolution. Quote, the main purveyors of funds for the revolution were neither the crackpot Russian millionaires nor the armed bandits of Lenin. The real money primarily came from certain British and American circles, which for a long time past had lent their support to the Russian revolutionary cause. The important part played by wealthy American banker Jacob Schiff in the events in Russia is no longer a secret. End quote. Anthony Sutton, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. Quote, international finance prefers to deal with central governments. The last thing the banking community wants is decentralized nations because these disperse power. Virtually everything the Soviets possess has been acquired from the West. End quote. Gary Allen, none dare call it conspiracy. Quote, communism and socialism are not a share the wealth program, but a consolidate and control the wealth program. Communism is not a movement of the downtrodden masses, but is a movement created, manipulated, and used by power-seeking billionaires in order to gain control over the world. First, by establishing socialist governments in the various nations, then consolidating them all through a great merger into an all-powerful world socialist superstate under the auspices of the United Nations. End quote. Winston Churchill, quote, Lenin was sent to Russia by the Germans in the same way that you might send a vial containing a culture of typhoid or cholera to be poured into the water supply of a great city. It worked with amazing accuracy, end quote. Frederick C. Howe, Confessions of a Monopolist, 1906. These are the rules of big business. Get a monopoly, get society to work for you, and remember that the best of all business is politics, end quote. Frederick C. Howe, Confessions of a Monopolist, 1906, quote, these are the rules of big business. Get a monopoly, get society to work for you, and remember that the best of all business is politics, end quote. Henry Davidson, J.P. Morgan partner and CFR member, 1912, quote, I would rather have regulation and control than free competition, end quote. Timeline, 1914 through 18. As World War I raged on, Lenin had been in Switzerland since 1905. While Leon Trotsky was in New York City writing for a communist newspaper, neither went to Russia because the poor huddled masses begged for their help, but only arrived later after being sent by the power elite in Europe and the U.S., as you will soon see. Meanwhile, World War I left 1,700,000 Russian citizens dead. There were also tremendous food shortages. Their money was practically valueless. They were still battling the Germans across the border, and the government was ready to collapse. In essence, the Russian people were primed for a revolution. March 1917, the Tsar Nicholas II finally abdicated his throne. Following his departure, Prince Lvov arrived on the scene to set up a form of government that he hoped would resemble America's. Shortly thereafter, however, Alexander Kerensky, revolutionary politico, stepped in and did away with Lvov's vision. Meanwhile, the Russians kept fighting the Germans while 250,000 revolutionaries returned to their homeland and toppled Kerensky. Spring 1917. Lenin and Trotsky returned to Russia with their pockets full of gold. July 1917. Lenin led his first revolution, but was abated by the Russian army. July 19, 1917. The Russian government arrested Lenin, charging him with being a German spy. He fled to Finland. November 7, 1917. Lenin returned to Russia and planted the seeds for another revolution. November 25, 1917. Makeshift elections were held. Less than 1/4 of the Russian people voted for Vladimir Lenin. Realizing he didn't have the public behind him, Lenin sent hordes of gun-toting radicals to make the ruling body of Russia see things in a different light. As World War I continued, the Rothschild-controlled banks of Europe pumped millions of dollars into Lenin's coffers. 1922, Russia became a full-blown communist entity with the state controlling all the resources in manufacturing. This bloody process cost the lives of 28 million citizens. In the same year, famine hit Russia and 5 million people starved to death. Lenin eventually saw the follies of Marxism and returned most of the state-run resources back to the people. Starvation quickly disappeared. 1924, Lenin died and Joseph Stalin took over, once more returning state control to the nation. Overall, in one short decade, 75 million Russians died due to this insanity. World War I, 1.7 million deaths. Lenin takeover, 28 million deaths. Starvation, 5 million deaths. Stalin takeover, 40 million deaths. Total, 75 million deaths. How could Trotsky, Lenin, Stalin, Kaganovich, and Litvinov get back into Russia when the government knew they wanted to overthrow it? Max Warburg, head of the German secret police, whose brother Paul was the founder and first chairman of the United States Federal Reserve Corporation, gave them $5 million in gold and put them, along with 159 other Bolshevik revolutionaries, on a sealed train, guaranteeing them access across the Russian border. Another item of note is that of all the Bolshevik revolutionaries, over half were Jewish. In addition, of the top 20 to 30 leaders of this movement, 75% were Jewish. Marx was born in Trier, Germany, and so was Leon Trotsky. The only person of any real significance who wasn't Jewish was Lenin, who was born in Simbirsk, Russia. Marxism of the elite. Karl Marx said, "Political power is the organized use of force by one class in order to keep another class in subjection." Said Vladimir Lenin upon accomplishing his mission, "Agree to any and every sacrifice and resort to all sorts of devices, maneuvers, and illegal methods to evasion and subterfuge." End quote. The first thing we need to realize about communism, and even more so about Clinton-like socialism, is that these movements aren't more so about Clinton-like socialism. Is that these movements aren't intended to help the poor, starving, or middle class who will eventually be eliminated. Instead, they're created by the ruling class, capitalists and bankers, to perpetuate the reign of those already in control. Power comes from the top down, not from the masses. Those who promote those concepts always talk about the people in need, the proletariat. Yet none of the leaders ever come from the poor or lower classes. Those in charge are always educated and intellectual. You see, here's the catch. The great myth revolving around socialism is that it's created to help the poor, that the end result is a classless society with no need for a government, police, or army. But stop for a second and think about something. When was the last time those in power ever willingly gave up their positions to let someone needier move in and take over? It doesn't happen. Especially when the primary motivating factor behind power and control is to keep it, then extenuate it. Communism and socialism don't redistribute the wealth. These forms of government are merely convoluted tools for the super rich to gain more power. The Bolshevik Revolution was orchestrated not from Moscow, but from New York City, Paris, and London. In communism and socialism, power derives from the state. The first thing you have to do is ask yourself, How much do you trust the state? Before answering, however, ponder the principal tenets of communism. 1. State ownership of all land. 2. A steeply graduated income tax. 3. No inheritance from deceased family members. 4. Confiscation of all property from political protesters. 5. A centrally run state bank. 6. State-run transportation systems, etc. Now compare these goals to the ones formulated by Adam Weishaupt and the Illuminati in 1776. 1. Abolish all existing governments to be replaced by a one-world government. 2. Abolish all religions. 3. Abolish all private property. 4. Abolish all inheritance. 5. Abolish the family. 6. Abolish nationalism. Although it's not popularly taught in the present day, Karl Marx, who was a member of the League of the Just, did nothing more than update the demented scribblings of Adam Weishaupt, who founded the Illuminati. In all reality, there's nothing new about the Communist Manifesto. The League of Just Men was merely an extension of the Illuminati after they were forced to go underground. While we're on the subject of Karl Marx, it should be noted that he didn't even write the original Communist Manifesto. He stole it from French socialist named Victor Thorn, who wrote Principles du Socialisme, Manifeste de la démocratie au XIXe siècle in 1843. W. Cherkasov, in Pages of Socialist History, goes so far as to say that the two works are so similar. The theories, the format, titles, and even chapter headings are stolen almost verbatim. Karl Marx is the same man who supposedly had such a great concern for the lower classes he dedicated his life to freeing them from their subservience. Yet Marx came from a well-to-do family. His father was a wealthy lawyer, and Karl rarely came in contact with the working class. In fact, Marx never worked a day of physical labor in his life. One of his few real jobs was as a correspondent and political analyst for Horace Greeley's New York Times. As a side note, both Greeley and Clinton Roosevelt of the infamous Roosevelt political family both gave money to the Communist League to have the Communist Manifesto published. Karl Marx survived by leeching off people for most of his life. 3 of his 6 children died of starvation because he never worked, while 2 others committed suicide. When Marx died in 1883, only 6 people found it in their heart to attend his funeral. Notes on Leon Trotsky. When arrested while traveling to Russia to take part in the Bolshevik Revolution, Trotsky was freed by orders given directly by none other than President Woodrow Wilson. He was given $10,000 traveling expenses by the Rockefeller family before leaving for Russia. Trotsky was the man who discovered that a variety of Wall Street bankers were up for bankrolling a revolution in Russia. While in New York City, like Marx, he rarely worked, yet was often seen entering the mansion of Jacob Schiff, who was undoubtedly one of the most powerful men in America at the time. Trotsky had training facilities, i.e. boot camps, at the Rockefeller-owned Standard Oil facility in New Jersey. When he arrived in New York City on January 13, 1917, Trotsky didn't have a job, yet he was able to maintain a top-dollar apartment and ride around in a chauffeured limousine. How was he able to live such a lifestyle? Money was bankrolled to him by Jacob Schiff. Why did Americans finance the Bolshevik Revolution? The biggest fallacy concerning the Bolshevik Revolution is that it originated from the people, from the poor huddled masses. In reality, it was financed by A. England's Lord Alfred Milner, B. Wall Street bankers such as J.P. Morgan and Company, and the Rockefeller family, C. Europe's Rothschild dynasty, and D. German bankers including Max Warburg, whose brother Paul was the key man in setting up America's Federal Reserve System. Stop for a moment and digest this information. Money for the Bolshevik Revolution came from super-rich Western financiers, some of whom were Americans. In essence, then, the very core of communism was a partnership between monopoly-oriented capitalists and the international socialist movement. Could it really be that Americans, those who should be the most fervently opposed to communism, would really finance their arch nemesis? And if so, who are these people? The traitorous Americans who turned their backs on this country accumulated their wealth during the latter part of the 1800s through banking, insurance, railroads, and industry. And even though they became incredibly rich through a free enterprise system, they are in actuality monopolists who want to eliminate any threat to their dominance. The notorious John D. Rockefeller even went so far as to say competition is a sin. It is for this reason that these men were drawn to financing the Bolshevik Revolution. Communism and socialism are obvious forms of monopolies because the government is the only operator. Since this is the case, we need to ask ourselves, who are the people who hold control over these forms of government? The answer: international bankers who lend money to the state at interest, then keep control over a central bank. If you then add clandestine contributions and donations, bribes, and covert behind-the-scene deals, you can see how an economic system is manipulated to best suit those who lurk in the shadows. Worse, these are the same backstabbers who also had a hand in starting World War I, setting up the criminal Federal Reserve System and the federal income tax in 1913, and who financed the Nazi rise to power before World War II. Who are these clever people? Surely by now you'll recognize the names: Rothschild, Rockefeller, Schiff, Warburg, Morgan, Harriman. Max Warburg and Alexander Helfand were the primary Germans who got the ball rolling in Europe in terms of money. Max Warburg is also the man who ran a Rothschild front bank in Frankfurt, while his brother Paul was instrumental in establishing the Federal Reserve in the United States. Jacob Schiff was a senior partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company and was related through marriage to the horrendous Warburg family. Below are a few specific examples of how money was funneled from the controllers to the Bolsheviks. England's Lord Alfred Milner, who was head of the Round Table founded by Cecil Rhodes of Oxford Rhodes Scholar fame, and also a front group for the Rothschilds and predecessor of America's Council on Foreign Relations, sank 21 million rubles into the Bolshevik Revolution. The American super-industrialist Averell Harriman said in June 1944 that Joseph Stalin bragged that about 2/3 of all the Russian infrastructure had been built with U.S. aid. After Lenin was thrown out of the country by Tsar Nicholas II, German bankers led by the Warburg family gave him a suitcase filled with $5 million, put him on a second train, and shipped him back to Russia to finish his job. The Washington Post reported on February 2, 1918, that William B. Thompson, director of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, gave the Bolsheviks $1 million. This first Soviet bank was run by J.P. Morgan through his Guarantee Trust Company. One of the most glaring examples of how deeply the United States was involved in assisting the Bolshevik Revolution took place at Petrograd in the summer of 1917. Under the guise of a Red Cross mission, 15 Wall Street financiers, their attorneys, and Federal Reserve Director William Bryce Thompson, along with a small group of doctors and nurses, traveled to the nerve center of the Russian Revolution. Naturally, the businessmen weren't in Petrograd to wrap wounds and take a patient's blood pressure, and when the doctors and nurses discovered their true motives, they left. The only problem was the bankers and lawyers remained. And why did they stay? Well, Herman Hagedorn, in his biography of William Bryce Thompson, provided photographic evidence that J.P. Morgan cabled Thompson $1 million through a branch office of his City National Bank in Petrograd to support the Bolshevik cause. These are American businessmen receiving money from J.P. Morgan, the real-life daddy warbucks, to help push the communist cause over the top. It's incredible, especially since Morgan's bank was the only one not nationalized after the Bolshevik Revolution. Also, 6 of those present in Petrograd, 3 were Wall Street bankers, later became members of America's Council on Foreign Relations in the 1920s. In essence, the controllers, those in England, America, and Germany, bought Russia for the paltry sum of 30 to 40 million. When you think about how much oil, real estate, and minerals are held within that enormous country, it was the sweetest deal of all time. Some people may protest. Why would those who supposedly support a capitalist system want to promote its very antithesis, communism? The answer is simple. What does it matter what a government does if you control it? Can't you see? The controllers have always bought and paid for each side of every conflict. That way, they never lose. In regard to the Soviet Union, their motive was clear. After the Bolshevik Revolution took place and a system was set up that epitomized non-productivity and inefficiency, they would always have to rely on the capitalist for a handout, i.e., loans at interest. Thus, whenever it came to money and technology, the sleeping bear could always be contained, because its very creation came about as a result of the controllers. Russia was under their thumb since day one. The same concept applies to our current welfare state. If we keep down what could potentially be a threatening group of people by making them dependent on cash payments and food stamps, they can be contained and made less dangerous. Notes and quotes on the Rothschilds, Jacob Schiff, and John D. Rockefeller. In the mid-1800s, there was a saying that circulated throughout Europe. There is only one power in Europe, and that is Rothschild. The secret to their growing success was a sense of invincibility, for even though they owned factories, businesses, mines, banks, corporations, and were industrial powerhouses, not one of these entities ever bore their name. Thus, they could do what they've always done, lurk in the shadows and pull the strings. Until recently, the British Museum had on display 2 checks made out from Nathan Rothschild to Karl Marx. In America, the Rothschilds worked through the banking firm of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, while the J.P. Morgan Company helped finance John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Corporation, Edward Harriman's railroad ventures, and Andrew Carnegie's steel factories. By 1900, it was estimated that the Rothschilds controlled half the world's entire wealth. With the above information in mind, and considering how prominent the Rothschild family was during the late 1800s, one must wonder why Karl Marx, who supposedly hated capitalism, never denounced the Rothschilds in the Communist Manifesto. The answer is twofold. First, communism arose out of the Illuminati-type secret societies that flourished during that time, and Marx was, similar to modern-day politicians, nothing but a figurehead who did the bidding of those behind the scenes. Also, how could Marx denounce the very people who not only financed his efforts, but would ultimately bankroll a revolution that carried forth his stolen ideas. The Rothschilds should have been Marx's primary target, but instead they didn't even merit a mention. Doesn't this principle seem to apply to what's going on today? Think about it. American banker Jacob Schiff went the extra mile to see that the Bolshevik Revolution came to fruition. Schiff was a Rothschild agent who in the mid-1800s took over control of the prestigious Kuhn-Loeb and Company and who financed John D. Rockefeller, Edward Harriman, and Andrew Carnegie. Schiff was also the man who gave $20 million to the Bolshevik cause. $20 million. He also brought Leon Trotsky to the United States without a passport, and when Trotsky was detained in Canada on an international arrest warrant, he convinced U.S. authorities to intervene and have him freed. After Trotsky went back to Russia, Schiff secured a large sum of money from the German banker, Max Warburg, then forwarded it to the conspirators in Russia who initiated the Bolshevik Revolution. Schiff was also instrumental in founding the Council on Foreign Relations and was a heavy contributor to Woodrow Wilson's campaign in 1912. In 1925, John D. Rockefeller told his press agent, Ivy Lee, to talk up communism in the American press so that it would be presented in a favorable light. This public relations drive helped push the U.S. government to officially recognize Russia in 1933. The United States illegally gave loans to the Bolshevik Revolution through the Federal Reserve. Averill, Harriman, and Standard Oil, Rockefeller owned, also negotiated trade agreements with the communists, and the Rockefeller-controlled Chase Manhattan Bank, along with Lord Milner of London's Round Table, who also lent them money. In 1922, Chase National Bank established the Russian Chamber of Commerce. In the New World Order, Eustace Mullins writes, the Rockefeller family is sometimes called the first family of the Soviet Union. About David Rockefeller, Time magazine wrote, as the de facto head of the American establishment, it has been said that for him the presidency would be a demotion. In 1927, Standard Oil built oil refineries in Caucasus, Russia, and was guaranteed half of all profits from its output. For decades, we've been told that capitalists and communists are enemies, or at least diametrically opposed in their outlooks. But this simply isn't the case. The Rockefellers are a case in point. 1. Before the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia was the world's #1 oil producer, even ahead of the United States. 2. After the revolution, however, due to all the chaos and turmoil, oil production came to a standstill. 3. Standard Oil stepped in during the next decade and started buying up the Russian oil fields. 4. Standard Oil also built the Russian state-of-the-art oil refineries. 5. In 1926 alone, the Rockefeller-owned Chase Manhattan Bank lent the Russians $75 million. 6. By this time, with things relatively back to normal in Russia, oil production began once again with the Rockefeller family getting a huge chunk, not only from the production, but also from interest on their loans in Russia, to Russia. 7. The Rockefellers were essentially the first entity to invest in Russia on a large-scale basis after the revolution. Their Chase Manhattan Bank helped fund the American-Russian Chamber of Commerce, while this very same bank financed Soviet raw material exports and sold Soviet bonds in the United States. Chapter 35, Reviewed, Anthony C. Sutton's Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. Have you ever seen news reports on TV that cover remote wars in Afghanistan or Sudan or Egypt? And the scenery is desolate, either sparsely vegetated mountains or barren deserts. Thus, you see that residents that live in these areas and they're gaunt, barely clothed, and look on the brink of starvation because the only thing they have to eat are rats or cactus or dogs or sand. But then the war footage begins, and these people who can barely clothe and feed themselves are sporting bazookas, anti-aircraft missiles, tanks, and hand grenades. It makes you wonder, where does the money come from? Sure, some of it is funneled through terrorist groups, but not all of it. With the above foundation in mind, let's hearken back to Germany in the 1920s. This country had been decimated by World War I. Unemployment was rampant, and hyperinflation virtually made the Deutschmark worthless. Then, all of a sudden, an impoverished flophouse artist named Adolf Hitler emerged on the scene and built one of the most imposing war machines in history. By the time he rose to power, the stock market had crashed in '29 and the world was in the midst of the Great Depression. So, framed within this context, one has to ask themselves, where did the money come from? Anthony Sutton's Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler answers this question in a startling fashion. On the inside dust jacket, the following overview is provided. Professor Anthony Sutton proves that World War I was not only inevitable, it was extremely profitable for a select group of financial insiders. Sutton conclusively establishes his thesis: the contribution made by American capitalism to German war preparations can only be described as phenomenal. It was certainly crucial to German military capabilities. It continues, not only was an influential sector of American business aware of the nature of Nazism, but for its own purposes aided Nazism whenever possible and profitable, with full knowledge that the probable outcome would be war involving Europe and the United States. Here is the thoroughly documented account of the role played by J.P. Morgan, T.W. Lamont, the Rockefeller interest, General Electric Company, Standard Oil, National City Bank, Chase and Manhattan Banks, Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and scores of other business elitists in helping to finance the bloodiest, most destructive war in history. With the above introduction in mind, I'd like to begin this essay reinforcing the main point of a review that will appear in Chapter 39, See Adolf Hitler and Black Magic. In that piece, Trevor Ravenscroft argues that the core of Nazism was founded on occultism and ritual magic. Well, in Professor Sutton's book, he confirms that the roots of Nazism were indeed based upon neo-pagan societies, the Bavarian Illuminati, and the Thule Society. Another point that must be made perfectly clear is one involving the responsibility for the Holocaust and how blame is often shifted away from American and European interests by passing the buck and claiming ignorance. Such claims are simply not true, as can be seen from item 4 of the program of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Number 4, none but members of the nation may be citizens of the state. None but those of German blood, whatever their creed, may be members of the nation. No Jews, therefore, may be a member of the nation. The above document was published in 1920, more than 2 decades before the final solution began. Also, Mein Kampf is littered with anti-Jewish rhetoric. So if you research this subject and come across individuals who say they were unaware of Hitler's anti-Semitism, it simply isn't the case. Those in control were well aware of his leanings, intentions, and inclinations. With these 2 points of clarification in mind, I'm going to proceed by breaking this review into 6 sections. 1. The financial octopus. 2. The Dawes and Young plan. 3. I.G. Farben. 4. American industrialist. 5. Henry Ford. 6. Finale. The financial octopus. The first point that Professor Sutton wants to make clear is that wide-scale wars and movements don't just happen. It takes a tremendous amount of preparation, planning, and behind-the-scenes string pulling to get them underway. In this vein, he'd like his readers to know that the same group of financiers who funneled money to the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and also bankrolled FDR's New Deal campaign in the early 1930s were also the same ones to bankroll the Nazis' rise to power. Take a moment and think about the ramifications of this statement. A shadowy cabal of bankers were simultaneously financing a communist regime, a fascist dictatorship, and the beginning of American socialism. I hate to break the news to you folks, but these are the same people who are still running your world today. At this point, the first question I would ask is, what institutions precisely were responsible for financing the Nazis? Mr. Sutton provides the answer. 1. New York's Federal Reserve Bank. 2. Bank of England. 3. Reichsbank. 4. Banque de France. You must remember, when you control the money supply, you're able to control the political machine. And once you control the machine, you call the shots on which political parties and movements are supported or denied. Thus, these men who ran the above financial centers were the ones pulling the strings on a worldwide basis. But just because they had money didn't allow them to assume total control. No, they needed to pull one more slick maneuver, although they were for-profit bankers. These individuals resorted to donning the uniform of statesmen and thus introduced themselves into domestic and foreign policy. As you'll soon see, these people are ingenious in their ability to undermine the system without anyone being the wiser to their shenanigans. The Dawes and Young plan. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles was formulated to force Germany into making reparations for their destruction. The Treaty of Versailles was implemented by a host of international bankers for their own benefit, and was ultimately approved and sponsored by the United States government. Out of this treaty, J.P. Morgan orchestrated the Dawes Plan, which was a series of loans made from American banks that ultimately resulted in the formation of I.G. Farben. This super powerful company came about because Germany diverted some of the money that was intended to pay off their loans into the merger of two chemical and steel companies, thus creating the notorious I.G. Farben Company. After the Dawes Plan failed, the Young Plan, 1928, was implemented. But all this program did was create hyperinflation, send unemployment through the roof, and fill the German people with such abject disgust that it paved the way for Hitler's rise to power. Thus, these treaties and plans that were supposed to return peace to the world instead accomplished the exact opposite. The international bankers turned into manipulative statesmen and reaped huge profits through interest payments, while Germany's war machine and I.G. Farben were created in the process. I.G. Farben. As money was diverted from loan payments into Germany's rearmament, I.G. Farben, an immense chemical empire, stood at center stage and acted hand-in-hand with the Nazis. Created in 1925, 3 years before the Young Plan was enacted, I.G. Farben became the powerhouse industrial force in Germany. Now here's where it gets interesting. A man named Max Warburg was on the board of supervisors at I.G. Farben, and his brother Paul, founder of the Federal Reserve, was also a member of Farben's American subsidiary. So, do you see what's going on? American bankers, in the guise of statesmen, created treaties and plans to loan money to the Germans, who siphoned off the money and formed IG Farben. Then, and here's the kicker, Farben set up a slush fund and funneled money to finance Hitler's rise to power. It's all starting to make sense, huh? After establishing himself as the Führer, Hitler told IG Farben that Germany needed to be self-sufficient in regard to rubber production, gasoline, oils, minerals, and explosives. Within a short time, Farben owned coal mines, electric power plants, iron and steel factories, banks, research units, and chemical refineries. Farben's monopolistic control of Germany was so vast that Professor Sutton provides these statistics to show their stronghold. IG Farben production, 1942. Synthetic rubber, 100%. Plastics, 90%. Explosives, 84%. Jet fuel, 46%. Oil, 100%. Gunpowder, 70%. Gasoline, 33%. Zyklon B, 95%. Yes, you saw that last item correctly. Zyklon B, the poison used to gas the Jews in the concentration camps. Did you ever wonder where it came from? Now you know. IG Farben, the company that extorted reparation money and financed Hitler, was the one who produced it. Since I mentioned the American arm of IG Farben, I figure it'll be useful to mention which companies had representatives on their board of directors. Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Bank of Manhattan, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Ford Motor Company. Now, do you know who owned Standard Oil of New Jersey? The Rockefeller family. And would you like to know a little tidbit of information? In 1939, when World War II was kicking in full bore, Standard Oil of New Jersey sold $20 million worth of aviation gasoline to a German company. Who do you think this company was? IG Farben. When news reports chronicled Germany's blitzkrieg across Europe and their fighter pilots were decimating cities, a Rockefeller-owned company was selling them fuel. It makes you wonder, huh? American industrialists. In this section, I'm going to quickly present a few examples that will show one of Mr. Sutton's main contentions in his book, that a variety of American businesses were well aware of the nature of Nazism and that they knew a war would result from their preparations. Knowing all this, they still went ahead and profited from their aid to the Nazis. So I'll simply start reeling off a few points from Professor Sutton's book. The two largest German tank producers were Opel, which was a subsidiary of General Motors and controlled by J.P. Morgan, and Ford AG. A few of the industrialists who helped Germany build its war machine were DuPont, armaments, Standard Oil, synthetic fuel products, International Harvester, arms manufacturing. The Kepler Circle was a group of German businessmen who supported Hitler's rise to power before the outbreak of World War II. This inner core, as it was called, had representatives on its board from Wall Street, Standard Oil of New Jersey, and ITT from 1933 to as late as 1944. Finally, there is strong evidence that after the United States government got into World War II and began mass bombings of Germany, every time the Air Force targeted an area, if an IG Farben plant was present, they were instructed by no means to destroy it. As you remember, IG Farben was the German war machine. Henry Ford. The strangest and most unsettling information that Professor Sutton presents in his book revolves around Henry Ford, founder of Ford Motor Company. The author states that not only did the Ford family profit from both the Allied and Axis war efforts, but that Henry Ford was actually decorated by the Nazis for his service to Nazism. To back his assessment, Sutton begins by saying that Henry Ford once claimed that there were two classes of financiers: those who profit from war and use their influence to bring about war for profit, and B, constructive financiers. Now reread Statement A and absorb the full impact of these words. There are men who profit from war and use their influence to bring about war for profit. That's some heavy information. The ramifications of this statement are mind-boggling and point directly to evidence of pure evil existing in this world. Think about it. The atrocities of war created to pad somebody's pocket. How sick. Sutton then tracked down a 1938 interview with Henry Ford that appeared in the New York Times. Ford is quoted as saying, "Somebody once said that 60 families have directed the destinies of the nation. It might well be said that if somebody would focus the spotlight on 25 persons who handle the nation's finances, the world's real war makers would be brought into bold relief." Here's a man in the know confirming the existence of a shadowy, conspiratorial, octopus-like group that controls the world from behind the scenes. He continues, "If these financiers had their way, we'd be in a war now. They want war because they make money out of such conflict, out of the human misery that wars bring. Now this isn't Joe Smo drinking beer in some bar and spouting off his mouth. It's Henry Ford, the man who invented the assembly line concept to mass produce automobiles, and a man who was certainly gifted with inside knowledge of how the system operates." But Ford was no saint either, as can be seen from the following details. He was the man who built the Soviet Union's first modern automobile plant in Gorky in late 1930. He also knowingly profited from both sides of the war, for his French and German affiliated plants produced vehicles for the Axis, while his American factories profited from the United States Army. In 1928, Ford merged his German assets with IG Farben, while in 1942, Edsel Ford urged his associates at French Ford to arm the German Wehrmacht. In essence, then, Sutton claims that Ford produced vehicles that were used against American soldiers that landed in France in 1944. If this is all there was to the story, someone could dismiss the above information as being coincidental or circumstantial. But regrettably, there is more. In the New York Times, dated December 20, 1922, a headline read, "Berlin hears Ford is backing Hitler," while the subsequent article states a rumor is current here that Henry Ford, the American automobile manufacturer, is financing Adolf Hitler's nationalist and anti-Semitic movement in Munich. Indeed, the Berlin Tageblatt has made an appeal to the American ambassador in Berlin to investigate and interfere. As I said earlier, there were many people who were either directly or indirectly associated with Adolf Hitler, and the Nazis who said that they had no idea about their anti-Semitic underpinnings. But just remember, this New York Times article ran in 1922, over a decade before World War II even began. This same New York Times article continues, the wall behind his desk in Hitler's private office is decorated with a large picture of Henry Ford. In the ante-chamber there is a large table covered with books, nearly all of which are a translation of a book written and published by Henry Ford. The book that this article referred to is Henry Ford's The International Jew, which was widely circulated by the Nazis and translated into a dozen different languages. Adolf Hitler even went so far as to quote sections of this book verbatim in Mein Kampf. Doesn't this scare you? Sutton also takes a quote from Jonathan Leonard's The Tragedy of Henry Ford that was relayed by Vice President Auer of the Bavarian Diet at a 1923 trial. Hitler openly boasts of Mr. Ford's support and praises Mr. Ford as a great individualist and a great anti-Semite. A photograph of Mr. Ford hangs in Herr Hitler's quarters. Now, if this were the end of the story, it would be damaging enough, but it doesn't end there. The final damning blow to Henry Ford comes from him not only being the most famous of Hitler's foreign backers, but on August 1st, 1938, a disturbing photograph appeared in the New York Times where Henry Ford is receiving the Grand Cross of the German Eagle from Fritz Heidler and Karl Kapp. Now think of the year 1938. World War I was about to begin. Germany had already begun its expansion, and its impact would be felt worldwide. But what is Henry Ford doing? He's receiving the highest Nazi decoration that can be given to a foreigner, the first time it was ever awarded in the United States. Finale. The implication of Professor Sutton's book are so profound that world events can never be seen in the same light again. Rather than unfolding independently and accidentally, it now becomes clear that wars, business transactions, monetary dealings, and backdoor deals are the order of the day. Instead of things just happening, this book makes it evident that strings are certainly being pulled from behind the scenes by a cabal of shadowy figures who are more interested in world power and profits than they are about human lives or our best interests. What we have in effect then is an entrenched group of international bankers who work in unison with big business to create a series of political upheavals that eventually led to World War I. After this global catastrophe, these very same figures implemented treaties and plans that padded the bankers' pockets with huge loan profits while resulting in German hyperinflation and unemployment. After the stock market crash in 1929, these hidden controllers eventually backed two world leaders, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Adolf Hitler. And what was the motivation for these manipulative machinations? Quite simply, the controllers wanted another war in Europe. As sickening and repulsive as this is, it's true. These are the types of individuals who run the world. This is the truth once you peek behind the veil of illusion. The infamous Carroll Quigley, author of Tragedy and Hope and a professor of international relations at Georgetown University, summarized the situation very succinctly when saying, "The powers of financial capitalism had enough far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole." So what is the end result of this fiasco? Essentially, the Federal Reserve Bank now has a virtual monopoly over the American economy, while groups like the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission determine our foreign policy. The international banks and bankers controlling all of the above groups then set the tone by acquiring markets and establishing an economic market base that is run by a tight-knit cadre of individuals that continue to increase taxation, perpetuate wars, manipulate our money, and keep us under their thumbs. But remember, all of this stuff just happens, and there's nobody behind the scenes calling the shots. Chapter 36, FDR and the Controllers' Wartime Traitors, Pearl Harbor. When researchers study American history and try to pinpoint certain time frames that signal the beginning of our takeover by the hidden ruling elite, the first glaring example is Woodrow Wilson, by far this country's most manipulated president. While Wilson and his evil cohorts like Colonel House were re-elected to their second term, the controllers were already searching for another candidate to take his place somewhere down the line. They found their pigeon in Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose family had been in banking since the 1700s. In fact, FDR's uncle, Frederick Delano, was one of the original members of the Federal Reserve Board. FDR was so familiar with elements of the shadow government that he said at one time, 60 families in America control the wealth of this nation. During the 1920s, he held 11 corporate directorships, 2 law partnerships, and was president of a law association. In his book, Wall Street and FDR, Anthony Sutton said, Roosevelt was a creation of Wall Street, an integral part of the New York banking fraternity. Curtis B. Dahl, FDR's son-in-law, went even further with this startling confession. Most of his thoughts, his political ammunition, as it were carefully manufactured for him in advance by the CFR One World Money Group. Finally, Des Griffin, in Descent into Slavery, characterized the Roosevelt presidency as such. Quote, in the 12 years during which he occupied the White House, FDR probably did more than any other single politician in history to bring to fruition the plans of the invisible government of the international bankers, keeping America out of war. On October 30th, 1940, Franklin Delano Roosevelt assured the American public, I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars. Considering how brutal World War II was and how Americans at that time wanted nothing to do with another European bloodbath, FDR's promise was noble. The only problem was he didn't mean it. In fact, he was lying through his teeth while uttering those words. How did I arrive at such a conclusion? In January 1941, only 3 months later and 11 months before the Pearl Harbor attacks, FDR's closest advisor, Harry Hopkins, traveled to England and met with Prime Minister Winston Churchill and told him, quote, the President is determined that we shall win the war together. Make no mistake about it, he has sent me here to tell you that at all costs and by all means he will carry you through, end quote. During this time, Tyler Kent, who served as a code clerk at the American Embassy in London, unearthed some secret wire transmissions between Roosevelt and Churchill, in which FDR disclosed that he intended to bring America into the war. Mr. Kent tried to reveal these transcripts to the American people, but mysteriously he was imprisoned until the war was over. The behind-the-scenes deceit was so blatant, FDR biographer Robert Sherwood concluded, if the isolationists had known the full extent of the secret alliance between the U.S. and Britain, their demands for the presidential impeachment would have rumbled like thunder through the land. Adding fuel to the fire, Henry Stinson, FDR's war secretary and a Council on Foreign Relations bigwig, wrote in his diary after meeting with Roosevelt in the fall of 1941, quote, we face the delicate question of the diplomatic fencing to be done so as to be sure Japan is put into the wrong and makes the first bad move, overt move. After his next conference with FDR, Stimson wrote on November 25, 1941, still 2 weeks prior to the Pearl Harbor attacks, the question was how we should maneuver them into the position of firing the first shot without too much danger to ourselves. It was desirable to make sure the Japanese were the ones to do this so that they should remain no doubt in anyone's mind as to who the aggressors were. Cracking the Japanese code. The most damning evidence of FDR's complicity in allowing Pearl Harbor to be attacked was the fact that American intelligence had broken the Japanese military and diplomatic codes that were used to communicate between Tokyo and its U.S. embassy as early as 1940. In addition, both Roosevelt and his cabinet knew the exact time and date of the attack from these transmissions. I realize that this is a bitter pill for many people to swallow, but FDR betrayed his country and his soldiers, for our intelligence knew what the Japanese were doing from hour to hour. These cracked codes were then sent to FDR and his Army Chief of Staff, General George Marshall. But cracked codes were only one part of the incriminating evidence against FDR and his cabinet. Admiral James Richardson adamantly urged FDR not to move his Pacific Fleet to Pearl Harbor because it was so exposed and vulnerable. And what thanks did he get? The admiral was released from his position because he would not issue FDR's traitorous orders. After decoding their messages, our intelligence knew that Hawaiian spies had told the Japanese every possible detail about our base at Pearl Harbor. A plethora of warnings about this imminent attack flooded in from Joseph Grew, Japanese ambassador, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, Senator Guy Gillette, and Congressman Martin Dees, the Korean underground, and various military personnel such as Brigadier General Elliot Thorpe and Colonel F.G.I. Wieserman. U.S. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall telegraphed his officers at Pearl Harbor on November 27, 1941, with this odd request: hostile action possible at any moment. If hostilities cannot be avoided, the United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act. How incredible and despicable. What in God's name were they thinking? Our ships were anchored and our planes were grouped together in broad daylight, while George Marshall told his officers at Pearl Harbor to wait until the Japanese made the first move. Unbelievable. Captain Johan Raneft, Dutch naval attaché in D.C., said that on December 6, 1941, naval intelligence officers reported the Japanese warships were only 400 miles from Honolulu. As the month of December 1941 began, our intelligence intercepted the Japanese Purple Code, saying their emissaries in D.C. should eliminate all official papers and evacuate the premises. On December 4th, Australian intelligence told U.S. representatives that Japanese warships and military jets that had dropped from sight a few days earlier were now moving toward Pearl Harbor. How did FDR react? He brushed aside the information as pro-war propaganda by the GOP. U.S. intelligence tracking the Germans, in addition to British sources, informed FDR's administration about the attack, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall and Navy Secretary Frank Knox said they couldn't remember where they were on the night of December 6th, a day that will live in infamy, permanently tattooed into every person's memory alive at that time, yet they couldn't remember their whereabouts. Which were later discovered. Both of them were at the White House with one individual. Guess who that was? Yep, FDR. I suppose something like that would be easy to forget, huh? Finally, consider this. Although our ships and aircraft were sitting ducks, the U.S. didn't have one aircraft carrier at Pearl Harbor when it was bombed. Why? Because battleships were outdated World War I remnants. To win in this theater of war, you needed carriers to transport bombers for flight. So even though we sacrificed our old battleships and some aircraft, the real strategic aces up our sleeves, our carriers, weren't present. We needed them to really keep fighting with. If you're still not convinced, the following is a telephone conversation between Winston Churchill and FDR that was intercepted by Axis spies in Holland on November 26, 1941, 10 days before the Pearl Harbor attacks. Churchill, referring to Japanese warships in the Pacific: "I can assure you that their goal is the fleet in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor." Roosevelt: "This is monstrous. Can you tell me, indicate the nature of your intelligence?" Churchill: "Reliable." Roosevelt: "The obvious implication is that the Japs are going to do a Port Arthur on us at Pearl Harbor. Do you concur?" Churchill: "I do indeed, unless they add an attack on the Panama Canal to this vile business." Roosevelt: "I will have to consider the entire problem. A Japanese attack on us would result in war between, and certainly you as well, would certainly fulfill two of the most important requirements of our policy." Roosevelt then mentions leaving the White House, adding, "What I don't know can't hurt me, and I can't understand messages at a distance." Let these words stew around in your head for a while. Chapter 37, FDR and the Controllers, Wartime Traitors, the Atomic Bomb. Edwin Stanton, Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of War, said, "Wars are not fought to defeat an enemy. They are fought to create a condition." End quote. FDR's reaction to foreknowledge of Pearl Harbor. Rear Admiral Theobald, in The Final Secrets of Pearl Harbor, wrote, "The anxiety to have Japan, beyond all possibility of dispute, commit the first act of war caused the President and his civilian advisors to disregard military advice to move the fleet at Pearl Harbor, which would have somewhat cushioned the blow." Notice Theobald's deliberate use of the word civilian advisors, those outside of government. This situation becomes more curious when we examine the reactions of FDR and certain members of his military staff, especially Admiral Stark, who was second in command under FDR. Admiral Stark, when given undeniable proof by Captain Wilkinson that the Japanese were about to attack Pearl Harbor and that they should warn their Pacific fleet, was told that such a move was unnecessary. Peculiar, don't you think? Worse, FDR and General George Marshall removed most of our air defenses before the attack and only had 1/3 of the necessary surveillance planes needed to protect the base in Pearl Harbor. They also refused to pass any information along to military commanders. Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter C. Short in Hawaii. But it doesn't end there. When Admiral Richardson, one of military's bigwigs, tried to tell FDR how vulnerable our fleet was in Pearl Harbor, FDR dismissed him. In the end, as we all know, Pearl Harbor was attacked. 3,300 military personnel were killed, and America was drawn into World War II. But as we've seen, many fingers pointed at FDR, his cabinet, and the controllers for possible foreknowledge of this atrocity. An investigation into this matter soon followed, but again, events were manipulated behind the scenes. How so? Of the 4-member Roberts Commission, one was Supreme Court Justice Owen Roberts, who was a globalist friend of FDR, and 2 were Council on Foreign Relations members, i.e. total insiders. In the end, no surprise, FDR was found free of blame, while Admiral Kimmel and General Short were used as scapegoats and charged with dereliction of duty. Now do you see how the system works? The Yalta Conference. In 1945, Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, and Franklin Roosevelt, all high-ranking Freemasons, met at Yalta, a Crimean resort in Soviet Russia. The official purpose of this conference was to finalize plans on how the Allies were going to defeat the Nazis and also to launch the establishment of the globalist-oriented United Nations. It's easy to see from FDR's actions that he was being directed from behind the scenes by those whose ulterior motives reflected an agenda that used America as a vehicle to promote their own aims. For example, 2 days before President Roosevelt left for Yalta and 7 months before Japan eventually waved the white flag, FDR received a 40-page report from General Douglas MacArthur. In these pages, the Japanese gave an unofficial offer of peace on exactly the same terms that the U.S. finally accepted when the war ended. But Roosevelt, acting as curiously as he had on many other occasions, didn't even take this memo to Yalta to show Churchill and Stalin. We have to remember that Douglas MacArthur was one of America's most highly respected generals, and also a war hero. Once we realize the powerful role of the war machine in the global decision-making process, we can see why FDR didn't sign a treaty with the Japanese, but instead decided to push forward and drop the bomb. Everyone knew our battle with Japan was over except for the final dance, but the controllers had to take the next step and move to a higher level by placing the atomic equation on the table. When viewed in this light, Churchill evaluated the decision best when he described Roosevelt as knowing he was powerless as a puppet in the hands of the international power brokers. Churchill's words shatter the illusion just a little bit more. Yes, by 1943, the United States could have ended the war with Japan, but we let it drag on for another year and a half. Why, when even in March 1945, 5 months before Hiroshima and Nagasaki became household words, the Japanese High Command offered America its unconditional surrender, but we rejected it. Why did we push their offer away? What reason did we give? Believe it or not, our intelligence said they couldn't interpret the Japanese memo. We broke the most complex of Japanese military codes and knew every step they were going to make, but we couldn't read straight text? Incredible. Also, by that time, we had thousands of Japanese prisoners in our internment camps who wouldn't have had any trouble reading this document. War as urban renewal. As repulsive as it may seem, the real reason we perpetuated and prolonged our war with Japan was for urban renewal. Yes, the theater of war, the big show, was nothing more than the creation of a condition. Pearl Harbor was the premise that lured America into a war that it didn't want to enter. Similar to the Lusitania, the Gulf of Tonkin, and the World Trade Center terrorist attacks, Pearl Harbor served as an igniter to incite feelings of nationalism and revenge among the masses. The formula is simple: create an enemy, start a war. But even as the Japanese dropped their bombs on our sitting duck battleships, they, as well as everyone else, knew that America would kick their asses, and we did. Yet, veiled in the shadows was the Institute of Pacific Relations, a controller front group that continued to push the international bankers' goals. So, to create the desired end result, we wiped out huge areas of the Orient, the first of many attacks over the next few decades, and began an urban renewal program. Out with the old, in with the new, and the machine keeps chugging along. Then we dropped the bomb, opening an atomic Pandora's box, elevating us to new levels of horror and fear. Began a Cold War with Russia, and spent even more money on the war machine. But I think I'm jumping ahead of myself, so let's look at this situation again and ask the question, why did we really attack the Japanese? The answer may surprise you. We declared war on the Japanese not because they were a threat to us, but to set the stage for economic redevelopment. The Japanese were still stuck in the past and had to be brought up to speed. Why? Because their country was essentially overrun with old peasant houses that needed to be cleared away. But how could the controllers accomplish this goal? Japan was ripe for the taking, but it needed modern factories and other types of economic buildup. But what could the controllers do? Aha! When all else fails, there's always the war machine. So the controllers had America attack Japan and totally wipe them out, putting its people into a total dismal condition. Then, when the Japanese were at their lowest point, completely broke and without hope, the international developers zipped in and scooped up the land, using it for their own benefit. Carroll Quigley, the oft-quoted insider and author of Tragedy and Hope, described the situation expertly. He wrote, How about American bomber planes engaged in the systematic destruction of all Japanese cities? The flimsy houses in these crowded urban areas made them very vulnerable to incendiary devices. On March 9, 1945, the Air Force tried a daring experiment. The defensive armament was removed from 279 B-29s, releasing weight for additional incendiaries, and these planes, without guns but carrying 1,900 tons of bombs, were sent on a low-level attack of Tokyo. The result was the most devastating air attack in all history, with the loss of only 3 planes. 16 square miles of central Tokyo was burned out, 250,000 homes destroyed, over 1 million persons were made homeless, and 84,793 were killed. This was more destructive than the first atomic bomb over Hiroshima 5 months later. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not a peace-knit bleeding heart by any means, and I certainly don't oppose America taking care of business when necessary. But I am irritated when warfare becomes a ruse to accomplish the controller's ulterior motives. Sadly, this scam job almost always the case even today. After World War II ended in 1945, huge amounts of money were pumped into Japan. And what were these funds used for? Well, how about newer factories, railroads, storage facilities, import and export docks, urban redevelopment, and office buildings? And more important, where did the money come from to completely rebuild Japan's infrastructure? You guessed it, the same people who started the war, the same people who profited from the war, and the same people who made a killing after the war. And in case you didn't know, these were also the same people who financed World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the Nazis' rise to power. These are also the very same people running our world today. Does it make you have affection for them? Do you feel any affinity for them? In 1945, even before the war had ended, the controllers were already planning their next succession of moves. They knew America would emerge from World War II king of the hill, so they immediately started providing counterbalances, one in Japan and the other in the Soviet Union. In the Japanese, they found a Slavish worker who was productive, dedicated, didn't question authority, and was easily conditioned. The result was that over 50 years ago, the controllers were already planning to undermine America so that it didn't become too powerful. Do you see the big picture now? Our strong industrial-based economic foundation was being slowly eroded way back then via the creation of cheap imports from the Orient. Thus, in 2002, instead of being primarily a producing country, we have become a consumer service economy and hugely indebted to boot. With imports flooding in over the past 3 decades from Japan, Taiwan, and China, and that's just in the Pacific Rim, plus the crushing effects of NAFTA and GATT, America is rapidly losing its economic grip. With cheap, subservient labor in third world countries coupled with open borders, the controllers keep reaping profits while America is going to wake up one day and cry, "What have we done? We let it all slip away." We need to look at who's controlling the world's money, who they're lending it to, what it's being used for, and the motivations behind it. Once we derive this type of knowledge, the overall picture becomes quite clear. World War II paved the way for the controllers to enter the Orient. Shortly thereafter, America was at war in Korea, then Vietnam, over the Golden Triangle. Now the stage is being set for China to assume its role as the new king of the hill. We'd better wake up to what's going on before it's too late. The writing is on the wall. FDR and the Controllers, Chapter 38, Wartime Traitors, Russia and the Atomic Bomb. In 1943, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his administration, on orders from the controllers, began giving the Soviet Union secrets as well as materials for building the atomic bomb. Note that 1943 is 2 years before the U.S. dropped the bomb on Hiroshima in August 1945. One of the key players in this outrageous act was Harry Hopkins, FDR's top advisor and Bolshevik admirer. Hopkins played an integral role in giving the Russians both the nuclear materials and blueprints to construct the bomb. If you find this information hard to swallow, listen to what Major General John R. Dean said in The Strange Alliance. Quote, American aid to the Red Butchers was carried out with a zeal which approached fanaticism, end quote. Air Force Major George Racy Jordan, in his published 1952 diary, revealed even more. Quote, there seemed to be no lengths to which American officials would go in aiding Russia to master the secrets of nuclear fission, end quote. The preeminent historian Antony Sutton, in his book Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development, wrote about this disturbing turn of events. Quote, Stalin paid tribute to the assistance rendered by the U.S. to Soviet industry before and during the war. He said that about 2/3 of all the large industrial enterprise in the Soviet Union had been built with United States help or technical assistance, end quote. Finally, Harry Hopkins himself assured a group of Russians at a Madison Square Garden rally in reference to atomic secrets that he was determined that nothing shall stop us from sharing with you all that what we have, end quote. One of the primary sources of information concerning this matter was Air Force Major George Racy Jordan's diary, published in 1952. Major Jordan obtained this knowledge while working as a supply expediter and liaison officer from 1942 to 44 at the Newark Airport and while serving at an air base in Great Falls, Montana. Major Jordan meticulously recorded all of the materials that were shipped to the Soviets during his employ, each of them crucial in building an atomic bomb. It must be noted that most people in America, Major Jordan included, didn't even know what an atomic bomb was prior to 1945, due, of course, to implicit secrecy. Here is a list of the materials shipped to Russia. Graphite, worth $812,430. Aluminum tubes, used to cook or turn uranium into plutonium, $13,041,152. 834,989 pounds of cadmium metal, worth $781,472. Thorium, $22,848. In January 1943 alone, we shipped 11,912 pounds of thorium from Philadelphia to Russia. Why did the Russians need aluminum tubes to turn uranium into plutonium? But that's not all. We also shipped 1,465 pounds of uranium chemicals and 2.2 pounds of uranium metal when our entire stock of uranium metal was 4.5 pounds. We surrendered half of our entire supply of this crucial raw material to the Soviets. In addition, we also dispatched over 1,000 pounds of deuterium oxide, commonly known as heavy water, to Russia in November 1943. Major Jordan also wrote that an incredible amount of materials was being clandestinely shuttled from Alaska to Siberia. But the story doesn't end there. Thousands of Soviet military personnel and scientists traveled to the U.S. in large numbers to visit our labs and bases. This was during World War II. Major Racy also recounts how he came upon questionable briefcases delivered to the Russians that had roadmaps to industrial sites and also classified military bases. One of them was to the Aberdeen Proving Grounds, a highly sensitive locale that was crucial during World War II. Along with the maps were engineering and scientific papers and reports from Harry Hopkins, including the words uranium, cyclotron, proton, and deuteron. Their briefcases also possessed maps for Oak Ridge, Manhattan Engineering District. Do you think that had anything to do with the secretive Manhattan Project? Guess it wasn't so hush-hush after all. Below is the annual total aid we gave to Russia while we were in the midst of World War II. 1942, $1,422,853,332. 1943, $2,955,811,271. 1944, $459,274,155. 1945, $1.838281,501 billion. Yes, $9.6 billion. $9.6 billion in aid to the Soviet Union. But once the war was over, did the aid end? Not by a long shot. General Leslie R. Groves lists the variety of items sent to post-war Russia. 121 merchant ships, 123 million. 1,285 trains, 103 million. Trucks and buses, 508 million. Tractors, 24 million. Telephone equipment, 33 million. Generators, 222 million. Well, lo and behold, on September 23, 1949, guess what happened? The Soviets tested and exploded their first A-bomb only 4 years after we did. For a long time, I wondered how they could have developed this technology so quickly. Here was an ass-backwards country that had been decimated by World War II and the ravages of communism. They were broke, hurting, starving, and hardly in any position to make this fantastic leap into the nuclear age, unless Des Griffin in Descent into Slavery summed it up best when he wrote, quote, "It was only when the Russians exploded their first atomic bomb in 1949 that the thunderous reality of where the Reds obtained their atomic secrets dawned on Major Jordan. These atomic secrets had come straight from the White House. The big question is, why? Why did the United States government find it so imperative to finance the Soviet war machine during and after the war and hand them over our nuclear secrets before we even fully developed the bomb ourselves? The answer might surprise you. We didn't, of our own volition, give them anything. Instead, FDR and his cabinet and later Harry Truman were mere implementers for the controllers, who were behind everything. The controllers created communist Russia in the first place by financing Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution during Woodrow Wilson's administration. Then, after World War I, which everyone knew would lead to World War II, due to the type of treaties that were put into place, the controllers realized when the A-bomb was dropped, there would only be one king of the hill, America. Why? Because every European country was decimated while the U.S. remained unscathed. We were at the top of our game both economically and also in regard to production. No wonder our confidence soared. We were the greatest, strongest nation in the world, and everyone knew it. But having one force mightier than any other is a tremendous threat to the controllers. Mere bankers, they could easily be thrust from their seats of power if a nation sets its mind to it. To prevent such a thing from happening, the controllers always plan ahead and make sure they have a backup to offset the winner of a certain war. And how do they determine who ultimately wins the war? Simple, they control the money and thus the loans. If a huge influx of money is suddenly cut off, how can a country's war machine keep churning ahead? Without loans, it's hard to buy or manufacture tanks, bombs, aircraft, guns, and uniforms. Realizing that America would emerge victorious, the controllers already began planning for a nation to act as a balance, someone to offset the U.S. vast dominance in every area. That nation happened to be the Soviet Union. Thus, preparations were being made before World War II had even ended. Now do you see why we were funneling so much money and supplies into post-war Russia immediately after the war was over? The controllers knew it was imperative to even things out quickly before America grew even more dominant. The same goes for our willingness to give our atomic secrets to Russia even before we dropped our own A-bomb. God forbid that America lasted too long as the only nation with nuclear capabilities. Don't you see? That would make our dominance too one-sided. Thus, Russia was our atomic balance. A secondary effect also resulted from the U.S. building up Russia's nuclear arsenal. It began a Cold War that lasted for over 30 years, up until Reagan's presidency. The Cold War created an overwhelming fear factor, bomb shelters, red scares, rehearsals of children instructed to crawl under their desks, apocalypse rumors, etc. The Cold War also led to the beginning of huge deficit spending to make sure one side didn't get more weapons than the other. By building a larger machine, we had to keep borrowing more money. From whom? You guessed it, the controllers. The further we were in debt, the more control they gained over us. Also, with an enemy, the commies, America had a way to justify all this outlandish spending. In the end, the controllers stayed in power. America became massively indebted. Russia eventually crumbled, and the people of the country focused their attention on a created enemy, the Soviets. Everything was balanced out, and the only winners were those who lurked in the shadows, pulling all the strings.